General Hospital will reveal interesting details on Friday, April 4, 2025. First, Ava stood frozen in the stillness of her apartment, the call from General Hospital still echoing in her ears like a death knell. The nurse's voice had been calm, almost detached, but the words were razor-sharp. Rick hadn't made it. The car accident, once believed to be a cruel twist of fate, had in fact been engineered with chilling precision. Christina had cut the brake lines. It was supposed to be Ava who paid the price, but Rick, an innocent soul with no part in their feud, had taken the wheel that day. He never stood a chance. Ava's mind reeled with disbelief, unable to process the brutality of the truth. Her knees buckled under the weight of the revelation, and for the first time in a long time, she felt powerless, utterly and irreversibly broken. The grief came slowly, not in waves but in a creeping, relentless tide that threatened to drown her. She collapsed to the floor, her hands trembling as they gripped the rug beneath her like it was the only anchor she had left. Memories of Rick surged forward, his warm smile, his calm demeanor, his quiet strength that had always been a balm to her chaos. He wasn't perfect, but he had seen something in her that others had long abandoned, the capacity to be loved, to be forgiven. He had stood by her when no one else would, and now he was gone, ripped from her life by a tragedy that wasn't his to bear. She didn't scream or sob. Instead, the tears came silently, streaming down her face in steady trails as her world crumbled around her. Inside Ava, a war raged between confusion, sorrow, and rage. She couldn't understand how Christina, someone who had once called Rick family, could orchestrate something so heartless. Did Christina know Rick would be the one to drive the car? Or was it just a reckless act of vengeance gone horribly wrong? Regardless of the answer, the result was the same. Death, irreversible and cruel. Ava felt the fire of fury rise in her chest, but it was muted by an overwhelming sense of guilt. She couldn't confront Christina, not yet. She didn't trust herself not to lash out, not to let the raw, unfiltered pain consume them both. She knew she had to make a decision, to find some kind of direction amidst the wreckage, but her mind was a storm of grief. Every path forward felt impossible, every breath an effort. She stared out the window as the last light of day faded behind the rooftops, her heart hollow and aching. Ava had lost people before, some to fate, some to betrayal, and some by her own doing, but Rick's death carved out a wound deeper than any she had known. He had represented a future she didn't think she deserved, a quiet promise that maybe, just maybe, she could be more than her past. But now that hope was gone, extinguished in one devastating moment. She no longer cared about vengeance or justice. What she wanted was something she could never have again, one more moment with Rick, one more chance to say she was sorry, one more opportunity to be forgiven, not for causing his death, but for dragging him into her storm. The chance would never come, and now Ava would walk a lonely road of redemption, marked forever by the silence he left behind. Second, the air grew heavy with dread the moment Jocelyn received the encrypted message. Her hands trembled as she read the cold, clinical words on the screen, her new mission, eliminate Jason. At first, she thought it was a mistake. There had to be some kind of error, some miscommunication. Jason? The man who had once protected her, who had stood in the shadows to shield those she loved. The name itself felt like a dagger to the chest. She tried to breathe, but the room seemed to close in around her. A chill ran down her spine as the weight of her reality sank in. This wasn't a bad dream. It was real. It was happening. And she was now part of something far more dangerous than she ever imagined. The silence that followed was not peaceful, it roared in her ears like a haunting symphony, each beat of her heart a percussive reminder that there was no turning back. Jocelyn knew exactly who the WSB were dealing with now. Brennan's influence ran deeper than she thought, and the fact that they had chosen her for this mission wasn't a coincidence, it was a calculated move. They had studied her, manipulated her, pulled her deeper into the shadows under the illusion of control. And now, they had asked the unthinkable. Jason wasn't just a name on a list. He was a symbol of everything she once believed in. And she couldn't kill him. She wouldn't kill him. But saying no would mean signing her own death warrant. In that moment, Jocelyn felt the walls of her world collapse. She had been so sure of herself, so determined to prove she could handle the complexities of this secret life. But this was different. This wasn't just spying or retrieving intel, this was murder. She wasn't a killer. She wasn't a weapon. But the WSB didn't care about what she was. They only cared about results. And Brennan, ruthless, methodical Brennan, was watching her every move. Failure would not be tolerated. Defiance would not go unpunished. She was trapped, a pawn in a game she no longer understood, and every path forward was laced with blood. As the night deepened and shadows crawled across her walls, Jocelyn sat alone, her mind spiraling. She couldn't tell anyone. Not Trina. Not Carly. Especially not Jason. And yet, every fiber of her being screamed to run, to confess, to warn him. But what if they were listening? What if this was another test? Her body trembled as she realized just how far gone she already was. She had stepped into a world that didn't allow second thoughts, where morality was blurred and survival meant silence. The music in her head grew louder, a slow, haunting melody of fate and fear. And she knew that no matter what she chose, nothing would ever be the same again. Third, Kai and Trina were caught in a moment that felt entirely their own, where the world outside faded away and only the heat of their connection remained. They sat close in the softly lit room, voices lowered to gentle tones as they exchanged glances that said far more than words ever could. Each touch lingered just a second longer, each breath became heavier, more charged. Desire hung thick in the air as their emotions surged beyond control. It was no longer just conversation, it was the beginning of something deeper, more intimate. Their bodies gravitated toward each other, hearts racing, as they prepared to surrender to a passion they had both silently craved. But just as their lips were about to meet, the door swung open with a suddenness that shattered everything. There stood Portia, frozen in the doorway, her expression a storm of shock and disbelief. The spell broke in an instant. Trina's eyes widened in panic, her cheeks flushed a deep red as she scrambled to compose herself. Kai immediately stood, clearly uncomfortable, trying to find words that simply wouldn't come. The charged atmosphere turned suffocating. The warmth between them was replaced by an awkward, stinging tension as Portia's presence loomed like a disapproving shadow over their vulnerability. Trina looked down, unable to meet her mother's gaze, while Kai clenched his jaw, struggling to balance dignity with discomfort. They hadn't meant for things to go this far, at least not in this way, not with an uninvited audience. The moment that had felt so private and genuine now lay exposed, vulnerable to judgment and misunderstanding. Portia didn't say a word, but her silence alone carried weight enough to crush whatever remained of the magic that had just sparked. Kai and Trina could feel the unspoken disappointment lingering in the room, complicating emotions that were already tangled in fear, affection, and uncertainty. The room, once filled with warmth and anticipation, now felt cold and stifling. Trina and Kai were left standing in a silence too loud to ignore, their hearts still pounding but now from embarrassment rather than passion. Yet despite the interruption, there was something undeniable in the way they looked at each other before Portia slowly backed out of the room. Even with the tension, their eyes spoke of something unfinished, a truth not yet fully explored. Though their love had been paused, interrupted in the most awkward way, it wasn't extinguished. It remained, quiet and persistent, waiting for the next chance to rise again. Fourth, the tension in the cafe was thick enough to cut with a knife. Curtis sat rigidly across from Drew, his jaw clenched, eyes burning with restrained fury. The two men, once allies, perhaps even friends, now stared at each other with a venomous silence that threatened to erupt at any moment. Curtis had agreed to this meeting only to get answers, but the moment Drew walked through the door with that smug, bitter expression, the air became electric with animosity. The betrayal ran deep on both sides, but Curtis could no longer ignore the disturbing depths to which Drew had fallen. Drew, for his part, made no effort to mask his contempt. He tossed his coffee cup on the table and leaned forward with cold intensity. "You think you're better than me, Curtis," he said through gritted teeth. "You think you can push me out of my own company and pretend like your hands are clean?" His voice was low but sharp, every word laced with accusation. Drew still hadn't forgiven being ousted from Aurora, and in his eyes, Curtis was the root of that downfall. In truth, Curtis had only acted out of necessity and survival, but Drew had rewritten the narrative in his own mind. One where he was the victim of betrayal, and Curtis the calculating traitor. Curtis didn't flinch, but his body was taut with fury. "Don't you dare turn this around on me," he snapped, voice rough with restrained rage. "You sold your integrity long before Aurora turned its back on you. And now I hear you're threatening Portia?" At the mention of her name, the atmosphere shifted, growing darker, more personal. Curtis slammed his hand on the table, drawing startled glances from nearby patrons. "You went after my wife, Drew. Using that Heather Weber test result, coercing her to cover your mess. That's not business. That's low, even for you." Drew's expression hardened, but for a brief second, there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. "I did what I had to do," he said, voice quieter, more defensive now. "Portia had her own reasons for hiding the truth about Heather's psychiatric records. I just helped her remember them." The veiled threat in his words made Curtis's blood boil. Portia had come home the night before visibly shaken, hesitant to speak, clearly terrified of what Drew might do if she didn't comply. Curtis had known something was wrong, and now the truth stood before him in the form of the man who dared to call himself a victim. The argument escalated quickly. Accusations flew like daggers, each man blaming the other for fractured trust, ruined reputations, and unforgivable decisions. Curtis brought up Drew's manipulation, how he used emotional blackmail like currency. Drew lashed back, accusing Curtis of playing both sides, pretending to be honorable while aligning with people who had no loyalty. The cafe, once a quiet refuge, became a battleground of words and old wounds. In the end, nothing was resolved. They stood up, faces inches apart, with a bitter promise in their eyes, this wasn't over. Curtis walked out, fists clenched, silently vowing to protect Portia from Drew's reach at any cost. Meanwhile, Drew remained behind, alone with his coffee gone cold, already calculating his next move in a game that was turning far more personal than he'd ever expected. Finally, they had weathered so many storms together, grief, betrayal, vengeance, loyalty tested and reaffirmed, but this time, it was different. Jason and Carly, bound by years of unbreakable connection, stood face to face not as allies, but as two hearts being pulled in opposite directions. Jason's instincts, as sharp as ever, screamed at him that Brennan was dangerous, a man who wore sophistication like armor, hiding the cold, manipulative predator beneath. He had seen men like Brennan before, calculated, ruthless, always playing the long game. Jason didn't need proof to trust what his gut already told him. Brennan wasn't just a mistake waiting to happen, he was a threat. And the fact that Carly, the woman he had protected and loved in his own silent, unwavering way, had allowed herself to fall under Brennan's spell. That broke something inside him. Jason confronted her more than once, choosing his words carefully at first, then more forcefully when her resolve refused to waver. He reminded her of who she was, how smart, fierce, and intuitive she had always been, but Carly stood her ground. To her, Brennan wasn't just a lover, he was a rebellion against every rule, every warning, every person who had ever told her who she should be. Loving Brennan, despite Jason's objections, became an act of defiance. She didn't want to be protected. She didn't want Jason making decisions for her heart. After so many years of leaning on him, Carly was desperate to prove that she could stand on her own, make her own choices, even if those choices meant risking everything. But love, even when tangled in defiance, cannot blind forever. Brennan's charisma began to crumble under the weight of his secrets. Late-night calls he wouldn't explain, conversations that stopped the moment Carly entered the room, plans that changed without warning, it all began to feel too familiar, too calculated. The man who once made her feel alive now made her feel watched. Then came the quiet threats, veiled in charm, the subtle ways he reminded her of what she owed him, what he had done for her, and what could be taken away just as easily. She wanted to believe it was her imagination, that Jason's warnings hadn't taken root inside her. But slowly, painfully, she realized the truth. She had invited a wolf into her life, and she had locked the door behind him. When Carly finally confronted Brennan about the lies, the mask slipped. In that moment, she didn't see the man she had defended so fiercely, she saw a stranger. Cold. Calculated. Dangerous. The realization hit her with the weight of her worst fear. Jason had been right all along. But by then, the damage was already done. Brennan had used her. Emotionally, strategically, and now he had leverage that could shatter everything she held dear. She had gambled her heart and lost. And worse, she had pushed away the one person who had always stood in her corner, even when she didn't deserve it. Jason never gloated, never said, "I told you so." That wasn't who he was. But Carly could see the ache in his eyes when she came to him, broken, humiliated, and full of regret. He had tried to shield her, not because he thought she was weak, but because he knew her worth. She had mistaken his concern for control, his warnings for jealousy. And now, standing before him with the pieces of her pride crumbling in her hands, she saw what he had been trying to do all along, save her from herself. Their love didn't vanish in the aftermath, but it was bruised. The silence between them now carried the weight of everything unsaid, the pain, the disappointment, the longing. Carly knew she would carry this regret for a long time. The knowledge that in trying to prove her independence, she had almost destroyed the one bond that had always been her anchor. And Jason, ever loyal, stood by her side once more, not to rescue, but to rebuild. But trust, once cracked, would take time to mend. In the end, they both knew that love was not just about passion or loyalty, it was about truth, and the courage to face it, even when it hurt.